Bill Phillips. I work for the Big Nerd Ranch. We train and we write apps, and I have a big old code presentation for you guys today about data binding. So my goal with, well, before I start talking about what I want to do with this talk, let me talk a little bit about who I am and where I come from. So my name is Bill Phillips. If you, for some reason, have that name ringing a bell in your mind, maybe it's because you saw it on the cover of this book. So I am one of the co-authors of the Big Nerd Ranch Guide to Android Programming. Raise your hand if you know the book. Does anybody know the book? Oh, I'm blushing up here. It's wonderful. So that's one thing that I do. I work on this, but I also write code and I go teach classes. So if you or your company needs to teach a bunch of people Android or iOS or front-end development, or if you happen to need some hired guns to write apps, well, think about Big Nerd Ranch. That's what we do. And that is all of the slides that I have for now. So I'm going to jump right over to my IDE. So my goal in this talk is I really kind of have three goals. The first one is I want to show you guys how to use data binding. And I don't mean show a bunch of code snippets. I want to show y'all how to actually go through the IDE from a project that doesn't have data binding in it and integrate it into this project. The next thing that I want to do is, rather than having a talk where I cover all of the features of data binding, I don't want to do that. Not because there aren't a lot of great features in data binding, but there are other talks out there that do that. Instead, here, I'm going to take an opportunity to look under the hood a little bit and hopefully demystify the data binding process for you guys. My thought is that when I first got into data binding, I was a little suspicious of a bunch of magic going on underneath the hood. So we're not going to look at all of that, but we'll look at enough of that that hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll have an idea of actually what's going on. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about was what destinations I might have in integrating data binding into my own code base. Whenever we're integrating a new tool, especially one that can do as much as data binding, we oftentimes in a professional context ask ourselves, how much am I going to use this? So I'm going to advocate a couple of different options for you on how much you can integrate this into your project. Now, I want to start by talking about what this project is. So this is an app called Criminal Intent, which if you're familiar with our book, you're probably familiar with Criminal Intent. It's the same app that is in the book. I've modified it in a couple of minor ways to fit with presenting data binding a little bit. But if I look at my emulator, I can see that Criminal Intent is a little app that is meant to log workplace crimes. So I've got a set of a whole bunch of automatically generated crimes here. If I click on one, then it's going to pull up a detail for that individual crime. For this presentation, I am not going to integrate data binding into the entire thing. Instead, we're going to just focus on this screen, the list activity. So if I look inside of my source code, and I'm going to switch back to the Android view over here. If I look at my source code, I can see that crime list activity is represented right here. And this is really just a thin wrapper around crime list fragment. So if I open up crime list fragment, I would see that this actually has the meat of my implementation. So I have my recycler view here. It's getting set up in onCreate view. If I scroll down to this update UI method, I see it setting up an adapter. And then crime adapter, if I jump to that declaration, I can see that is using a tool, crime holder. Crime holder is using this list item crime. So I'll look at crime holder right quick. It's not too exciting. I've got 3 views that I'm interested in there, the title, the date, and a solved checkbox. And I pull them out, and every time I bind to a new crime, I set up those views with the new information. That actual layout file looks like this. Again, nothing too exciting going on here. I've got a relative layout with 3 children in there. The details of how those are related to one another, not super important for the context of this discussion. But that's the basic architecture that we're dealing with. So what I'd like to do is, I'd like to start working with data binding in this project. So the first thing is I do need to have my tools up to date. So I do have an up-to-date version of Android Studio, and inside of my main project level build.gradle, I have my Gradle tools up to the most recent version for this version of Android Studio as well. So you want to make sure you have that before you even start. But then on this specific project, to enable data binding is really to enable two parts. One part of data binding is this part that's going to rip through our layout files and automatically generate Java classes. So there's a part of data binding that's integrating with the build process here. So that's why one reason I need to modify my build.gradle. The other reason is that there's a part of data binding that is integrated to the IDE as well. So what I do inside of my build.gradle is I say data binding enabled is equal to true. And then I go ahead and resync my Gradle. And when I do that, it's turning on both of those. It's saying, okay, turn on the IDE integration, turn on the build integration. The next thing I need to do to integrate data binding is I need to go into my resources, into the layout file that I want to enable data binding on. So list item crime was what we were working with earlier, so I'll crack that open. And what I need to do is wrap this entire XML layout file in a tag called layout. So I just type out layout there, and I'll wrap this in here. And then to clean things up, I will tab that in a little bit. Note that I don't actually even need to move over my XML namespace declarations. This will work just fine. And I have seen sometimes if I go directly through this route that for my next step I actually have to start and restart Android Studio, but I was talking to Yeet earlier and he was saying that if I just open a random resource file it might fix that. So I'm going to open a random resource file and maybe it'll smooth up my lecture here a little bit. Now by doing that, by wrapping my layout file and turning on data binding, I've automatically triggered the generation of a binding class. And that binding class is named after my XML file. It's just camel cased instead. So list item crime turns into list item crime binding in my Java code. So what I'm going to do is go into crime list fragment, into my adapter here, and where previously I was just inflating that layout file, what I'm going to do instead here is I'm going to call data binding util.inflate. And I pass in my layout inflator, import that class, and I pass in the layout file I want to inflate, the parent, and then false. And this should, and we'll see how lucky I get, all right, awesome. So that did indeed work. Thank you, Yeet. All right. So it did generate that class for me. So there's list item crime binding, and I'll name that binding, and I'll assign the result of that data binding util inflate call to that binding object. Now, usually that binding object is going to be used in the same place where I was writing my code in my holder object that I defined. You know how my holder had the views pulled out and I was assigning things to it? That's kind of the realm that my binding object is working in. So I'm going to take that binding object and pass it in to my crime holder object, and then I'll navigate over to my crime holder and change this to list item crime binding, and I'll do this handy option return shortcut to create a field for that and assign it. So now I've got my binding. What can I do with it? Well, the first thing I need to do is my super constructor still needs to get the view. So how do I get it? Well, every binding, well, the most basic thing that it does is it has a reference to the view hierarchy it inflated. So inside my binding, I can say binding.getRoot, and that will yield the view that was inflated underneath that. Pretty cool. More interesting is that when I inflate using data binding, it'll automatically rip through my layout file and look at every view that has an ID on it, create a field for that view, and assign it to it without me doing anything else. So I can right here, since I already have the mbinding field, I can say mbinding, and you can see that I've got fields for title text view, date text view, and solved checkbox. So I can immediately substitute out all this code I had for my binding code. And then I can just nuke all this code here and here. So that's one cool trick that I get immediately. As soon as I wrap it in layout, in that layout tag, it starts doing this for me. Another thing that I can do as soon as I wrap it in that layout tag is inside the layout file itself. When I wrap my layout in this layout tag, I get to use something I call the binding mustache operator. So what is that operator? Well, I've got this field here, padding here, that I've defined as @dimen list item padding 2x. And if you go and look inside this, you can see that all I've really done is defined a dimension that is twice the size of another dimension. Now, because of the way that my resource system works, if I want to have something that's twice the size of another, I pretty much have to define another item there or do it in my Java code. But what I can do with the binding mustache operator is I can actually use simple Java expressions here. So what I could do is instead of saying 2x, I could actually multiply that list item padding by 2. And it works fine, works great. So these are the two things that I get with this simple kind of data binding, with this layout tag on the outside and these simple usages of this binding mustache operator. Now, one thing I do want to say about this is, remember I was saying that there is a code generation part of this, but there is also an IDE integration part of this. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look here. When I autocomplete on mbinding, I get a bunch of Java methods. These have been generated by the data binding framework for me. So there is somewhere sitting out there a Java class that has this code written in it. Now, where things get interesting is in the IDE integration. Now, if I right-click on mcrime and say, go to declaration, where's it going to take me to? Anybody know? Exactly, right where I had that field declared is where it's going to take my cursor. So what do you think is going to happen when I right-click on this? You would think the same thing, right? I go to declaration. It does not take me to the generated code, though. It takes me to where I effectively did declare it. Effectively, I declared it in my XML file when I wrote that ID inside of a data binding context. So that's the IDE integration at work. It is a little confusing the first time you see it because you think, hey, this is a field that should take me to a field. But in practice, when we start working with this, this ends up being really, really handy. So this actually is kind of my first stopping off point. I mentioned at the beginning that I had a couple of different destinations that I was interested in taking you guys. And this is one of them. This is what I call step 0 data binding. And by that I mean that all I've done is wrapped my layout file in this layout tag and I've used it in my code. I automatically get view extraction. I get these simple uses of the binding mustache operator if I want to use those as well. And I didn't really have to invest much into this. I'm a big fan of this, and the nice thing about this level of commitment to the tool is that it doesn't really impose anything on you architecturally in your application. You can pretty much build your apps the same way you did before and use this as a nicer version of, say, something like Butter Knife. This has got a fewer steps involved. If I add a view in here, I can immediately start using the field in my code. So I'm a big fan of that. All right. So let's get a little deeper into this. Things get a little more interesting in data binding with the next section I'm going to introduce here. So I've got the top level layout tag, but I can also define a data section here. In the data section, I can define values that I want to pass into the layout file. So here, the value that I'm really interested in my existing code is I've got all this stuff referring to crime. So I can define a variable named crime in my layout file that has that same type. So that defines a variable named crime. At the same time I define that, inside of crime list fragment, I would see that my binding object gets an additional method. I have a getter and a setter for crime now. So I am going to set the crime on my layout file every single time that I bind to this view holder. Now that I've done that, I can refer to that variable within my layout file in my binding mustache context. So where would that be useful? Like here in my checkbox, I could say checked is equal to at binding mustache crime.isSolved. I just call the isSolved method, and that gets populated directly from the crime that I pass in. Same thing goes for my title. I say text crime.getTitle, and the same thing goes for my date. crime.getDate.toString. Since that is returning a date object, I want to make sure and convert it to a string. Again, I can use simple Java expressions here. So what if I want a fancier date here, right? Let's say that I want to say that the date that this crime was discovered was such and such. Well, I could type out with double quotes like I would in Java, but I would have to escape it inside of my XML here. So that's kind of annoying. Data binding allows me to instead use a backtick to do this. So I can say date discovered plus, and I build up my string that way. Pretty handy. Now, some of you may be looking at this who know your Android very well and thinking to yourselves, Bill, I can't localize this string. What are you doing? Well, I can use my string values here too. So I happen to have defined, before the lecture, another string. So I can say @string/list. What did I name that string? I forgot about it. I named that list item date format. And the syntax on this is a little different. It acts kind of like a function. So I pass in the value that I want to format, and that should work great. Now, one other additional thing that I can do here is I can set up click listeners if I like. So I don't know if you all recall, but in my crime list fragment, my crime holder was handling these click events. I set this on click listener to this on the top level item view, and then I handled the click inside of on click here. Well, if I want to, I can pass that in directly. I can make another variable for the holder and complete that out again. Crime list fragment.crime holder. And then on my relative layout up top, I can say on click, and I can use a little lambda expression here. So I know that my on click listener takes in a view and yields nothing, so I can say view and then holder.onClick view. And I've already made an error here. There we go. Weirdly enough, I was trying this last night, and if you leave off the the binding mustache on that, it just keeps running fine. I found that kind of surprising. No error. And obviously, it doesn't work when you try and click on it. But So now I've got this, and I also want to say binding that set holder this. But now I can cut out even more code here. So I can cut out that. I can cut out all three of those. And I don't even really need that viewed on click listener code here either. So that's pretty nifty. So I'll run that, and I'll talk a little bit while we're waiting for Gradle to build. Or not build, as the case may be. Forgot to remove that override. And this will work exactly the same way it did before. The difference is that I've got all of that code wired up inside of my layout file instead. So let's see. Are we running? Yes, we are. So that's pretty cool. It's pretty nifty that I can move that over there. So there is actually something that's a little wrong here, though. Let's see if anybody's got sharp eyes. I'm going to scroll through this and just yell out if you see anything funny. Does anybody see anything weird going on? The data is auto-generated, so it's going to be the same. What's going on with the checkboxes? Yeah, they're kind of animating into place or something, right? So that's kind of weird, right? So let's dive in a little bit and see what's going on with that. Why would that be happening? So remember, this is a generated code library. So that means that when I, inside of my crime holder, call setCrime, that is running some Java code behind the scenes that is triggering everything that I see on this screen. Now, of course, if I command B into that, it's going to just send me to that variable, which normally is what I want. But right now, I don't know exactly what's going on. Now, normally, because of the IDE integration, it will not always generate that code for me. It's kind of doing some magic behind the scenes so that we can have a seamless editing experience without waiting for those compile cycles to happen. But since I ran it and deployed it to the device, I do get the generated code. All I have to do is switch over in my IDE view to look behind what's going on. Now, my Android view isn't going to show that to me, so I'm going to switch to the project view. And inside the project view, I'm going to crack open build. And it's not in the generated code. It is in the intermediates section. And under intermediates, I have classes, debug, and then I'm going to dive down into COM, Big Nerd Ranch, Android, criminal intent, and then there's data binding. So it generates those classes in a subpackage in there called data binding. And if I crack that open, sure enough, there I see list item crime binding. So if I double click that, I see some pretty well formatted for generated code, but not super duper readable. Some generated code here. So let's look in here for that set crime setter to see what's going on. So I see it called there. That's not what I want. I want the definition. This is what I'm interested in. So here set crime is taking in my crime, and it's assigning it to an IVAR, and it's marking some dirty flags, calling this notify property changed method, and then calling this request rebind. Let's look at this request rebind in the superclass. Inside here, it's checking to see if it has a pending rebind, and if it is, it's flagging that. And if it is flagging that there is a pending rebind, it posts this callback. So this may or may not mean anything to you. The important thing to note about this is that since it is posting a callback to either a choreographer or a handler, that means that it is not immediately running this code. It is running it, one tick later. If I were in my crime detail activity that wasn't scrolling or anything, I wouldn't care about that. But that tick is what's causing that little animation to play. So what we want to do is we want to get rid of that tick. So what we're going to do is back inside of list crime fragment, we want to say, right after we say set crime, execute these bindings immediately. Do not wait We are not going to make any additional changes to the layout. You can go ahead and run this. And we do this by calling a method on binding called executes pending bindings. And all that does is immediately run this method on the binding generated class called execute bindings that takes care of the work of taking all my values from crime, running all of my expressions in my binding mustaches, and assigning them. So, let's go back to our layout. So when I showed you how to use variables here, I was kind of showing, in a lot of ways, the simpler way of doing things, or the more Java-y way of doing things. Data binding has some additional syntactic sugar that can make this stuff a little easier for us. Some of it that we're actually relying on right now. So for example, one example would be here. This crime.getDate.toString. Let's say that I, for some reason, decided to, in my crime and get date, just return null. Maybe there was a bug somewhere, who knows? So it'll take it a second to run that. But data binding does some automatic null handling for me. So data binding, when I have an expression like this, it actually has a behavior that it relies on when it is trying to call a method on a null value. So for example, here, getDate is null, but when I call toString on it, instead of throwing a null pointer exception, what it'll do is just say, well, if I'm calling a method that returns an object on a null object, I'll just make the whole expression return a null object. So this is convenient for our view-related code, where we may not have the space in here to do all of the error handling that I might want to do to make it perfect. Another thing that I can do in data binding is I don't have to type out everything completely like this. GetDate is a property notation, and in data binding, I can abbreviate that to just date. Works exactly the same. Same thing goes for my title, and it respects the isSolved too. So I can say crime.solved, and that also works. Another thing that I get inside data binding is I have a null coalescing operator. So let's say that I decide that maybe null isn't something that the user wants to look at on this screen. So I could inside here say question mark, and say never instead. And then when my date is null, when my string is null, it will yield never instead of null, which is maybe something that my user might prefer to look at. So that's a little bit more syntactic sugar. Let's start playing around again with how things work. So this binding mustache operator. I want to talk a bit more about how this works. So let's say that I decided for some reason to write Android all caps and use a binding mustache operator to assign that to true. I can go inside here and rebuild my project, and this will work fine. This will compile. If I ran it, it would work great. I would see all caps in my application. But if I remove that binding mustache operator here, in this specific case, I've chosen this all caps attribute somewhat deviously. In this specific case, when I rebuild the project, it'll error out on me. It says no resource identifier found for attribute all caps in package Android. So I, of course, saying, oh, duh, I must have gotten it wrong. It's actually text all caps, right? So I rebuild it and run again, and I get the exact same error. That's kind of weird. Well, if I look closely at what's going on, I'll see some weird things. Like, where did that tag come from? And if I scroll up here, I'll see that I actually don't have a data section here. The reason for that is that, unlike other code generation libraries, data binding is generating two things. It is generating the Java classes, but is also generating modified versions of the layout files that I pass in. And the reason it does that is because the binding mustache operator does not use the same inflation mechanism that the XML layout does. So I would actually go fix this by going back to my source here and saying text all caps. But that brings up the other question. Why did all caps here work when I had the binding mustache? The reason this works is that the default behavior of data binding is actually to set properties on the views that I'm looking at. And if I were to go inside my documentation for text view, I would find that it has a property called all caps and a method called set all caps. So what's happening when I use the binding mustache here is it is looking at that and saying, oh, that must be referring to that property. So I'll just go and assign that. So that's what its generated code is doing. And if I were to look inside of this file, I would see, and I'm not going to see that here because I didn't do a rebuild to regenerate this, I would see that that all caps attribute would be gone because it's going to be handled by the data binding processor instead. This gets a little interesting when I ask myself questions like things that I think I should be able to do in data binding, but I don't know exactly how it would work. What do I mean by that? Let's say that I, inside of my crime holder, wanted to add a text watcher to my title text view. Add text change listener. So text watcher is a listener interface that is different from the on-click interface that I used earlier. The on-click interface only had one method, which means that I can use a lambda expression for it. But text watcher does not. It has 3 methods on it. So how can I use data binding with this? This gets into what are called binding adapters. So essentially, data binding has some extra helper classes that are on board to make it possible to do something like this. The way that I look for those, and I'm going to delete this right quick, I can actually open up the binding adapters that ship with data binding and take a look at them. So what I can do is say Command O for open class, and I can say text view, and you see that text view binding adapter class there? Let's open that up. So this is text view binding adapter. The reason it's called a binding adapter is it's meant to adapt fields or properties or methods that you would want to use in binding in a data binding context to that data binding context. So at the top of a lot of binding adapters, you'll see these kind of annotations up here. These are where you'll find things like that text all caps one that we ran into. These are used for just simple aliases. So here, this attribute is saying text all caps is referring to the method set all caps. So now I can use it just like I would a normal layout file. This kind of alias thing isn't going to work for text watcher, though. So I'm going to scroll down, and let's look for text watcher and see if there's something in there that I can use. And sure enough, there's a set text watcher method and an app binding adapter annotation on top of it. So this set text watcher method takes in a text view that I'm processing in data binding, and then a set of parameters. For each parameter I take in, there is a corresponding attribute up here. So I can see I've got attributes before text changed, on text changed, and after text changed, and corresponding interfaces for those 3 attributes. So what are those interfaces? Well, if I navigate to them, if I navigate to that declaration, I can see that all that they've really done is split up that text watcher interface into 3 separate interfaces. So now I've got interfaces that I can use inside of a lambda expression or otherwise. So what goes on inside here isn't of a whole lot of interest. It basically takes those three interfaces that come in and schleps them together into a single text watcher that it can add onto this text view. So if you find yourself in this circumstance of, I've got some view that I don't know how to use data binding with, check out the binding adapters. They may very well have what you need in them. All right, so you'll notice that I've gone a very long time and I have not talked about another destination. I was talking about this step 0 data binding earlier. The last destination I want to talk about is something I don't have time to go into great depth on, but is what I'm going to recommend as your next destination in integration if you choose to pick up data binding. And that is model view view model. So let's look at our layout file again. From a standpoint of maintainability, I kind of have an issue here. The concern that we want to address with data binding, it is a great, powerful tool. It's wonderful. But the problem that we can run into is the issue of having too much code in our data binding. It is not easy for us to create an instance of this and put it under a unit test. It's full of all these views and stuff. We would really rather have a pure Java class to test instead. And as long as I have both crime and holder in here, anything in the relationship between crime and holder is going to show up in code in my data binding file. So what I recommend doing is instead creating a separate class called a view model to hold this. So I'm going to create crime view model here. And it will need to have, to run the click listeners, it's going to need an activity. Because it'll need to fire an intent. So I'll create a field for that. And it's going to need a crime also. And then on my view model, what I do is I expose directly the values that I want to put inside of my layout file. So for example, I'd have a method getTitle here, and I'd return mcrime.getTitle. Same thing goes for rendered date. I'm going to have to do my null checking by hand here, unfortunately. Is not equal to null. Earn mcrime.getDate dot toString. And I do the same thing for my solved. So I just get rid of this here. And instead of crime and holder, I will have just one view model. I neglected to add one thing. I do also need to have the click handler here on crime clicked. And I'll say crime pager activity dot new intent m activity and crime dot get ID and start activity intent. So then I wire that up here. View model dot on crime clicked. And then I substitute view model elsewhere. And change that to rendered date. Get rid of the toString. So the advantage to doing it this way is in the long run and maintainability. Right now, the payoff doesn't look that great. I'm just calling directly through to another method, right? And it looks like I've got the builder. Oh yeah, I need to have, and I'm almost running out of time, which I suspected would happen, but I was aggressive. I was like, I can get through this data binding stuff. So I need to have getters and setters for crime, and inside of list fragments, I need to set view model, new crime view model, get activity, assign that to a field in view model, and then I say viewModel.setCrime here. And now we should be good to go. Now the downside of doing things this way is that it'll appear to run initially appear to look great, but when I scroll down through here, you'll notice that it doesn't repopulate those. And the reason why is look how inside my bind crime I'm triggering that. I'm saying viewModel.setCrime, but when I dive into that, there's nothing there to trigger any binding code. So what we do to solve this is we change this so that it instead extends this observable class, base observable. So this is another tool that comes with data binding. And when I have an observable class, what I can do is I can mark specific getters as bindable. And that is advertising to the binding framework that these specific properties are available to be bound. And then, more importantly, when I call setCrime, I can call this method notifyChange. And what that will do is it will signify to data binding that all of my bindable properties have changed. So this time when I run it, this should all get populated correctly. All right. And I think that takes me to the end of everything that I had. So the last thing I wanted to mention before I get running here, I was really maybe unwisely trying to jam-pack this talk with as much stuff as I could. But the things I didn't have time for in this presentation, one, there's so much more to say about model view, view model, that architecture. There's plenty of blog posts out there to talk about it. I recommend going and checking that out if you're interested in data binding. Includes. This is where we have data binding within our data binding. It turns out this is really handy in practice. I was kind of skeptical of it, but it really becomes invaluable. It allows me to compose binding layouts together. And then finally, two-way data binding. That's where I am able to send stuff to and receive stuff from. So like I have an editable text view or something like that. My things to remember, if you enjoyed this talk and want to take something home, take home no data section. That's a totally legitimate approach. You can absolutely do that. Number two, Mr. Binding Mustache. He eats the XML attributes. He spits out Java property setters and binding adapter invocations. He is a different way of going through this layout process. And finally, use view models if you are going to go dive headfirst into this stuff. It is, in the long run, we've been really happy with it at Big Nerd Ranch in our consulting work. It's really paid off for us. And that's it. Thank you very much. Did I leave any time for questions? Is there any? I'd love to take questions if I have time for it. I don't know if there is a difference in the size of the, so the question was, what's the size difference in the APK between something like Butterknife and something like this? Yeet is probably the guy to ask about that. My guess, since I'm up on stage and I get to talk, my guess would be it's not an appreciable difference. All caps refers to a property on text view. It does not refer to any sort of layout attribute at all. It's not defined, doesn't exist. Yeah, so data binding can process attributes that don't exist. Oh, you just test the heck out of that view model, man. It's great. That's the great thing about the view model, is it's really, you just invoke things on it and make sure you get out what you would expect. And that's it, I'm done. So I've been signaled that I am out of time. So thank you guys so much. And enjoy.